The sailors were already dead when the ships pulled into port. It was October 1347, and 12 Genoese galleys had just docked at the harbor of Messina, Sicily. The crowd gathering on the docks expected grain, spices, silk, the usual cargo from the Black Sea routes. What they found instead was something that would haunt European memory for centuries. Most of the sailors aboard were corpses. Those still breathing were barely alive, their bodies covered in black, oozing boils the size of apples. Blood and pus seeped through their clothing. The stench hit people on the dock before they could even see the ships clearly. Sicilian authorities immediately ordered the fleet out of the harbor, but it was already too late. The rats had left the ships. The fleas had found new hosts. The bacterium Yersinia pestis, one of the most efficient killing machines biology has ever produced, had just set foot in Europe for the first time. What nobody on that dock could have known, what nobody in Europe could have imagined, was that this single moment would kill between 25 and 50 million people over the next 5 years. It would collapse a social system that had dominated the continent for 500 years. It would break the Catholic Church's grip on the European mind, and, paradoxically, grotesquely, it would give the poorest and most oppressed people in medieval history the first real taste of something resembling freedom. But before any of that happened, there was just the dying. Vast, incomprehensible, unstoppable dying. And to understand what came after, you first have to understand what the Black Death actually felt like, from the inside. The plague didn't announce itself politely. It began with a flea bite, usually on the leg or arm, from a flea that had been feeding on an infected black rat. The bacteria entered the bloodstream almost immediately and began traveling toward the nearest lymph node. Within hours, the infected person felt the first symptoms: a creeping fever, a bone-deep fatigue, the peculiar sensation of aching in every joint at once. They probably thought it was a common illness. They probably went to bed hoping to feel better in the morning. They did not feel better in the morning. Within a day or two, the lymph nodes began to swell. In the groin, the armpit, the neck, wherever the nearest cluster of nodes was located. These swellings, called buboes, were not subtle. They grew rapidly, becoming hot, red, excruciatingly painful. Eyewitness accounts from the time describe them reaching the size of a small apple, sometimes an egg. Boccaccio, the Florentine writer who survived the plague and documented it in meticulous, almost clinical detail in the introduction to his Decameron, wrote that the tumors grew indiscriminately, spreading from the groin or armpit to other parts of the body. What followed the buboes was worse. Dark spots, black or livid purple, began appearing on the skin of the arms, thighs, and other parts of the body. Sometimes large and few in number, sometimes small and numerous. Both kinds, Boccaccio noted with grim precision, were the usual messengers of death. The fever intensified. Victims began hallucinating. They could not walk, could not sleep, could barely breathe. Some screamed continuously. Others fell into a stupor and simply stopped responding to anyone around them. Vomiting, uncontrollable and bloody. Hemorrhaging under the skin that turned flesh black. In some cases, the pneumonic form of the plague infected the lungs, at which point the disease became airborne. A single cough could transmit it to anyone nearby. In this form, death came within hours rather than days. The septicemic form could kill before the buboes even had time to develop, with victims found dead in their homes apparently without having shown any external symptoms at all. Medieval doctors, Men who based their entire understanding of disease on the 1,300-year-old texts of the Roman physician Galen had absolutely nothing in their arsenal that worked. The standard treatments of the time included lancing the buboes to drain the pus, applying poultices of butter and onion, bloodletting, and drinking solutions that included ingredients like powdered egg and treacle. One contemporary medical prescription from England suggested roasting a freshly laid egg and grinding it into powder, then mixing it with treacle, chives, and ale. Patients were told to drink this for 3 evenings and 3 mornings. It did not help. A recipe from the University of Paris recommended fumigating homes with burning herbs and avoiding physical exertion. It did not help either. Nothing helped. Boccaccio noted with flat bitterness that the sick died the 3rd day from the first appearance of the symptoms, some sooner, some later, without any fever or other accessory symptoms. And so the doctors, the priests, the nobles, and eventually everyone else ran. This is the detail that historians keep coming back to when they discuss the social devastation of the Black Death, because it was perhaps more psychologically destructive than the deaths themselves. People abandoned their own families, not the cruel or the heartless or the weak-willed, everyone. Boccaccio documented it with a kind of stunned disbelief. Brother abandoned brother, uncle abandoned nephew, sister abandoned sister, husband abandoned wife. Most devastating of all, parents abandoned their own children, left them in their homes, shut the door, and walked away. Because to stay was almost certainly to die alongside them, and the human instinct for survival overwhelmed everything else: love, duty, faith, the most fundamental bonds of human society. The streets of Florence filled with the dying and the dead simultaneously. Corpses rotted in homes and were not discovered until the stench traveled through the walls. Gravediggers demanded extraordinary wages to touch the bodies, and even then, many refused. To understand why the plague spread so devastatingly and so quickly, you have to understand what medieval European cities actually looked like. Because the common romantic image of the Middle Ages, with its stone cathedrals and colorful markets, leaves out the part about the sewage. In medieval Paris, several street names were directly inspired by the French word for excrement. There were multiple streets named after human waste in various grammatical forms. Pigs, cattle, chickens, geese, goats, and horses roamed freely through the streets of London and Paris. The concept of hygiene in the modern sense did not exist. Germ theory would not be developed for another 5 centuries. Rats thrived in conditions that were essentially designed to maximize rat comfort: open food sources, abundant shelter in the walls of wooden buildings, and a complete absence of any systematic effort to control their population. The same fleas that lived on the rats had no particular preference for rats over humans when the rats began dying in large numbers. And the rats were dying everywhere, all at once, because the plague killed them too. The origins of the catastrophe trace back to Central Asia, probably to the steppes of what is now Kyrgyzstan, where archaeologists have found Nestorian gravestones from 1338 to 1339 with inscriptions explicitly referencing plague. From there, the bacterium traveled westward along the Silk Road, the vast network of trade routes that connected China and Central Asia to the Middle East and the Mediterranean. It reached the Crimean Peninsula in the territory around the Black Sea, where a political event in 1346 would inadvertently serve as the delivery mechanism for one of history's greatest disasters. The Mongol Khan, Jani Beg, was besieging the Genoese trading city of Kaffa on the Crimean coast. His army, already decimated by the plague that was tearing through his ranks, had reached a desperate impasse. And so, Jani Beg made a decision that would change the course of European history. he ordered his catapults to launch the corpses of plague victims over the walls of the city. The tactic was intended as a form of biological warfare, a way to infect the besieged population when military force alone had failed. And it worked, though probably not in the way Johnny Beg intended. The more significant vector of transmission was not the catapulted bodies, but the rats and fleas on the ships of the Genoese traders who fled the city in panic, carrying the disease with them across the Black Sea toward the Mediterranean. The contemporary chronicler Gabriele de Musis from Piacenza described the scene at Kaffa: the mounting dead on both sides, the desperation, the terrified traders fleeing in their galleys with sickness clinging to their bones. One ship arrived in Constantinople, which had a population of several 100,000 people, and which lost an enormous fraction of them within months. The 13-year-old son of the Byzantine Emperor John VI Cantacuzene died of the plague there in 1347. The emperor himself wrote a description of the disease modeled on Thucydides' account of the plague of Athens, which tells you something about both the severity of what he witnessed and the literary self-consciousness of the Byzantine elite, even in the midst of catastrophe. From Constantinople, the disease fanned out in multiple directions simultaneously, following every trade route, every ship lane, every road. By October 1347, it had reached Sicily. By January 1348, Genoa and Venice. A few weeks later, Pisa, the critical entry point into northern Italy. By June 1348, it had crossed the Alps, reached France, Spain, Portugal, and England. A single ship from Calais docked at Melcombe Regis in Dorset in August 1348, and within weeks, Bristol was devastated. The disease moved northward through England with mechanical efficiency. London suffered its worst losses between February and May of 1349. The north of England, Scotland, and Scandinavia fell to it by 1350. It reached northern Russia by 1352 and Moscow by 1353. In 5 years, it had covered the entire known European world. The scale of death was simply outside the range of medieval comprehension. In Paris, a city of roughly 100,000 people, approximately half the population died. Florence lost so many of its citizens that Boccaccio described finding fresh corpses in the streets every morning, laid out by the survivors during the night. The city eventually established mass graves, enormous pits where bodies were layered in hundreds, stacked like sediment. The historian Agnolo di Tura of Siena wrote that he buried his own 5 children with his own hands. He wrote, "So many died that all believed it was the end of the world." The chronicler Henry Knighton in England reported whole villages completely extinguished, not a single survivor. Fields of crops stood unharvested through autumn and winter because there was no one left to bring them in. Livestock wandered untended through deserted countryside. The church, which was supposed to provide comfort, spiritual guidance, and the crucial last rites that determined whether a medieval Christian soul went to heaven or hell, was devastated both institutionally and theologically. Priests died at the same rate as everyone else, in many cases faster, because their role required them to go into infected homes. Monasteries lost half their members. Many priests simply refused to enter the houses of the dying to administer last rites, condemning their parishioners, in the theological framework of the time, to eternal damnation. The Pope, Clement VI, issued a papal bull allowing people to receive absolution simply by expressing contrition, even without a confessor present, which gives some measure of how catastrophically the Church's normal infrastructure had collapsed. Clement himself stayed in Avignon, sitting between 2 large fires that his doctors had told him would purify the air, receiving petitions and issuing decrees while everyone around him died. The theological crisis generated by the plague was profound and long-lasting. If God was all-powerful, all-knowing, and just, why was this happening? Medieval Christianity had a well-developed framework for explaining suffering, primarily around the concept of divine punishment for sin. The flagellant movement emerged from precisely this logic. Groups of men, sometimes numbering in the hundreds, who marched from town to town in processions, whipping themselves bloody with leather straps studded with metal spikes 3 times a day for 33.5 days at a time. The number was symbolic, the years of Christ's earthly life. They sang hymns and begged God to spare the survivors. Townspeople came out to watch, sometimes weeping, sometimes joining. The movement spread rapidly through Germany and the Low Countries in 1349, before the Pope condemned it as heretical and it abruptly dissolved. But it tells you something essential about the psychological state of medieval Europeans during the plague. They were not merely frightened. They were convinced they were watching the end of the world, and they were willing to tear their own flesh open in public to try to stop it. The scapegoating was immediate and vicious. Jews had been subject to periodic persecution throughout medieval Europe, but the Black Death triggered pogroms of a scale and brutality that had not been seen before. The accusations spread across Germany, France, and Switzerland with remarkable speed. Jews were poisoning the wells. There was no evidence for this. There could not be, because the actual mechanism of the plague's transmission, rat fleas carrying Yersinia pestis, would not be identified for another 5.5 centuries. But medieval populations needed an explanation that fit their conceptual universe, and a conspiracy theory was easier to accept than the alternative, which was that the universe itself was random and cruel and did not respond to prayer. Jewish communities in dozens of German and French cities were massacred. Some were burned alive in their synagogues. In response, King Casimir III of Poland offered refuge to Jews fleeing the violence, triggering a mass migration eastward that would shape the demographics of Eastern Europe for centuries. None of it stopped the dying. By 1352, when the first wave finally exhausted itself, not because of any human intervention, but simply because it had run out of dense population centers to tear through, somewhere between 1/3 and half of Europe's population was gone. The precise figures are impossible to establish with certainty and vary significantly by region. Some areas, particularly in Italy, parts of Scandinavia, and East Anglia in England, saw mortality rates above 50%. Others, including parts of Poland, certain alpine villages, and some rural areas with limited trade connections, were nearly untouched. But the aggregate effect was transformative in a way that no event in European history before or since has matched. Entire aristocratic lineages simply ceased to exist. Major cities became ghost towns. The social and institutional infrastructure of the continent, the church, the nobility, the manorial system that had organized agriculture since the early Middle Ages, had been catastrophically damaged. And now the survivors had to figure out what came next. The world they had known was gone. The rules that had governed it were still technically on the books, but the people whose job it had been to enforce those rules were dead in staggering numbers. And the people who had spent their entire lives at the bottom of that system, the serfs and the peasants and the landless laborers, the people who had never in 500 years been allowed to say no to anything, were suddenly, unexpectedly, desperately needed. For the first time in recorded European history, ordinary working people had leverage. They didn't know it yet, but they were about to find out. Before the plague arrived, the life of a medieval serf was not a life in any meaningful sense of the word. It was a sentence. You were born into it, you worked in it, you died in it, and your children inherited it automatically, the same way a nobleman's son inherited a title. The feudal system that had organized European society since the early 10th century was not merely an economic arrangement. It was a total framework of existence, a divinely sanctioned hierarchy that placed every human being in a fixed position from birth to death, with essentially no possibility of movement. At the top sat the king, who owned all the land. Below him, the great nobles, who held enormous territories in exchange for military service and political loyalty. Below them, the lesser lords, who managed individual manors. Below them, the knights, who provided the military muscle. And at the very bottom, accounting for somewhere around 90% of the entire population of medieval Europe, the serfs. The men, women, and children who worked the land, fed everyone above them, and received in return the bare minimum required to keep them alive and productive. The mechanics of serfdom were specific, systematic, and deliberately designed to eliminate any possibility of escape or negotiation. A serf could not leave the village where he was born without his lord's explicit permission. He could not marry without permission. He could not grind his grain into flour except at the lord's mill, for which he paid a fee. He could not sell his own produce freely. He could not take a dispute to any court other than the lord's own court, where the lord himself was judge. He owed his lord a fixed number of days of free labor per week, typically 2 or 3 days working the lord's own fields, called the domain, in addition to paying a portion of everything he produced from his own strip of land. He paid fees when he was born, fees when he died, fees when his daughter married, fees when he inherited from his father. The system had a name for the fee paid when a serf died and his son wished to inherit his holding: the heriot. It was usually the family's best animal, their most valuable possession, extracted at the moment of maximum grief and vulnerability. What made this system sustainable for 500 years was not primarily violence, though violence was always available and regularly used. It was numbers. Europe before the Black Death was densely, desperately overpopulated relative to the agricultural technology available to feed it. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 had already killed millions, and the continent had barely recovered when the plague arrived. In an overpopulated world with no shortage of labor, a serf had no leverage whatsoever. If he ran away, there were 10 men behind him waiting for the same strip of land. If he demanded higher wages, the lord simply hired someone else. The entire power dynamic of medieval society rested on one fundamental economic reality: there were always more workers than work. The Black Death did not merely disturb this reality, it obliterated it in the span of 5 years. The change was not immediately obvious in the first months after the plague's initial wave. People were still dying, still fleeing, still too stunned and traumatized to understand what had happened at a structural level. But by 1349, as the first wave began to recede in some areas and survivors emerged blinking from their isolation, the arithmetic had become impossible to ignore. The manor that had employed 40 serfs before the plague now had 12. The fields that required 100 hands to bring in the harvest were untended. Livestock were wandering through unplowed ground. Crops were rotting. And the surviving peasants, the men and women who had spent their entire lives being told they were replaceable, interchangeable, barely worth accounting for, discovered that they were suddenly, desperately, irreplaceably valuable. A serf who walked away from his manor in 1350 would find that the lord of the next village over would hire him immediately, no questions asked, at wages his father could never have imagined demanding. The economic data that historians have reconstructed from English manorial records, the most detailed surviving documentation of post-plague labor conditions anywhere in Europe, is striking in its clarity. Wages in England rose between 12 and 28% in the decade immediately following the plague, from the 1340s to the 1350s. By the 1360s, The increase over pre-plague levels had reached 20 to 40% in many regions. In some specific instances, the spike was even more dramatic. At Fornham All Saints in Suffolk, records show that in the plague year of 1348 to 49 itself, a lord who had been paying the standard pre-plague rate of 3 pence per acre for reaping was suddenly paying 5 pence per acre, a 67% increase for the same work in the same season, because there was simply no other option. The labor that had been the cheapest commodity in medieval Europe overnight became the scarcest. The serfs who remained on the land also discovered something even more psychologically significant than higher wages. They could leave. Not legally, the law had not changed. But practically, the enforcement mechanisms of the feudal system depended on a network of local officials, lords' agents, and village hierarchies that had itself been decimated by the plague. The men whose job it had been to track down runaway serfs and return them to their manors were dead, or overwhelmed, or busy managing their own survival. A serf who slipped away from his village in 1350 and presented himself to a new lord as a free laborer would often find that the new lord was not particularly interested in asking detailed questions about his legal status. What mattered was whether he could work, and he could work. The Brown University historian's summary of this period captures it precisely. Serfs were no longer tied to one master. If one left the land, another lord would instantly hire them. The lords had to make changes to make the situation more profitable for peasants simply to keep them on their land at all. The entire logic of the system had inverted. For 500 years, the lord had held all the cards. Now the peasant held them, and both sides knew it. The question was what the lord would do about it. The answer from the ruling class was swift, panicked, and revealing in its desperation. As early as June 1349, while the plague was still actively killing people across England, King Edward III issued the Ordinance of Labourers, a royal decree that attempted to legally freeze wages at pre-plague levels and compel all able-bodied men and women below a certain age who were not already employed to work for anyone who demanded their services, at the old rates, under penalty of imprisonment. 2 years later, in 1351, Parliament codified and expanded this into the Statute of Labourers, which created a formal enforcement mechanism, including special commissions with the power to prosecute both workers who demanded higher wages and employers who offered them. If a worker left his post for better pay elsewhere, his employer was given the right to have him imprisoned. The statute explicitly targeted the new mobility of the post-plague labor market, attempting to reinstate by law the economic conditions that the plague had destroyed in fact. The Statute of Labourers was enforced with considerable energy in the early 1350s. Thousands of prosecutions were recorded. Both workers and employers were hauled before the new commissions, employers as frequently as workers, because desperate landowners were often more willing to break the law and pay higher wages than to leave their fields unworked. The English chronicler Henry Knighton, writing from the perspective of the elite with barely concealed fury, noted that laborers had become so arrogant and obstinate that they took no notice of the king's command. They demanded not just higher wages, but better food, better clothing, and treatment that Knighton clearly considered outrageously inappropriate for their social station. His tone of indignant disbelief is itself historically significant. It tells you that the peasants were not merely asking politely. They were demanding, and they were getting what they demanded, because the alternative was no harvest, and starvation for the lord as surely as for everyone else. The economic pressure was compounded by a psychological shift that is harder to document, but impossible to miss in the sources. The plague had struck without any respect for social hierarchy. The king's son died. The archbishop died. The pope's own court at Avignon was devastated. In England, 2 successive archbishops of Canterbury, John de Stratford and John de Ufford, died within months of each other in 1348 and 1349. The belief that social hierarchy reflected divine order, that the Lord was the Lord because God had intended him to be the Lord, and the serf was the serf because God had intended the same for him, took a severe blow when it became apparent that God's plague had no particular preference for the lowborn. The serf, watching his lord cough up blood and die in the same way he watched his own brothers die, could not help but notice that the divinely ordained hierarchy was not, in fact, being respected by the disease. This is the moment when the cultural consequences of the Black Death begin to diverge from the strictly economic ones, and they are equally important for understanding what happened next. The art of the period, the paintings, the illuminated manuscripts, the carvings in churches, became saturated with images of death. The danse macabre, or dance of death, emerged as a major artistic motif. A skeleton leading people of every social rank in a dance toward the grave, the Pope and the King alongside the peasant and the beggar, all equal in their mortality. The message was not subtle. Death doesn't care about your title. The same infection that killed your serf will kill you. The same worm that eats his body will eat yours. This egalitarian message of death had practical consequences. It eroded the psychological foundations of deference. A serf who had watched his lord die of the same disease that killed his neighbors, whose priest had refused to give his mother last rites out of fear for his own life, whose local enforcer of feudal obligations had either died or fled, this person had a fundamentally different relationship to authority than his grandfather had. The unquestioning acceptance of social hierarchy that the feudal system depended upon was not something that could simply be legislated back into existence by the Statute of Laborers. The ruling class could pass laws. It could not pass a law restoring the psychological disposition of submission that had taken 500 years to cultivate and 5 years of mass death to shatter. The elite understood this instinctively, even if they could not articulate it in those terms. And so, alongside the economic legislation, they reached for a different kind of tool: sumptuary law. These were laws regulating what different social classes were permitted to wear, own, and display. In 1363, the English Parliament passed a sweeping statute dictating in meticulous detail what fabrics, colors, and styles of clothing were permitted to each rank of society. Silk was forbidden to commoners, so was silver. Furs above a certain value were restricted to the nobility. The reasoning was explicit. Peasants were dressing above their station. With their new wages, they were purchasing clothing and food and household goods that had previously been accessible only to their social superiors, and the nobility found this intolerable. Not merely as an aesthetic offense, but as a fundamental threat to the legibility of the social order. If you couldn't tell a serf from a merchant from a minor noble by looking at them, the entire visual grammar of medieval hierarchy collapsed. The sumptuary laws were widely flouted and essentially impossible to enforce consistently. But their existence tells you something important about the nature of the post-plague crisis from the perspective of the ruling class. They were not merely trying to solve an economic problem, labor costs. They were trying to reassert a total social order that had been disrupted at every level simultaneously. The economic, the legal, the theological, the cultural, all of it had been destabilized by the same event. And the methods they chose to address the destabilization? Wage freezes, labor restrictions, dress codes, prosecution of anyone who stepped outside the assigned boundaries of their social role, were essentially methods of trying to rebuild the world as it had been before 1347 by force of law alone, in the absence of the demographic conditions that had made it possible in the first place. What the ruling class could not legislate away was the simple arithmetic of supply and demand. Wages continued to rise despite the statutes, sometimes legally and sometimes illegally, because lords who needed their fields worked simply could not afford to hold the line. The academic research on English wages in the decades after the plague shows the trajectory clearly. Even with the Statute of Laborers in force and actively enforced in the early 1350s, wages continued to climb through the 1360s and 1370s. By the mid-1370s, the post-plague inflation that had briefly helped lords by raising grain prices had given way to deflation and abundant harvests, which reduced the lords' income while the cost of their labor continued to increase. The economic squeeze was relentless, and it fell hardest on the middle tier of the feudal system, the minor nobility and the smaller landowners, who had neither the political influence to shape legislation in their favor nor the resources to absorb the pressure indefinitely. The peasants, meanwhile, were making choices that would have been literally unthinkable a generation earlier. They were moving. They were renegotiating their tenure agreements. They were converting their servile holdings, the plots of land they had worked as serfs, into contractual leaseholds, which carried entirely different legal implications. A serf holding land under the old system was personally unfree. His status as a serf was attached to him as an individual, regardless of what land he worked or where he lived. A tenant holding land under a leasehold contract was legally free, with contractual rights that could be enforced in royal courts rather than in the lord's own court. The distinction was not merely technical. It was the difference between being property and being a person with rights. And thousands of peasants across England and Western Europe were making that transition in the decades after the plague, not through any grand political revolution, but through the accumulated effect of individual negotiations, individual departures, individual refusals to accept the old terms. The lords pushed back wherever they could. There were attempts to reimpose serfdom by force, to drag runaway villains back to their original manners, to reassert the old dues and services through legal action. Many of these attempts succeeded locally, at least temporarily, but the overall trend was inexorable. The demographic reality simply could not be reversed by legislation. There were not enough people. There was not enough enforcement capacity, and there was a spreading awareness among the surviving peasantry, built from the specific experience of watching the plague kill rich and poor alike, of seeing their labor suddenly valued, of being courted by competing lords for the first time in their family's memory, that the hierarchy was not natural and eternal. It was a construction. It could be renegotiated. And if it could not be renegotiated peacefully, it could be challenged by other means. By the 1370s, the tension that had been building since the first post-plague wage demands had become acute. The ruling class, squeezed between falling agricultural revenues and rising labor costs, began reaching for the one tool they had reliably available when economic and legal pressure failed: taxation. And it was taxation, the imposition of new, regressive poll taxes on a peasant population that had spent 30 years being told that their newly acquired economic gains were illegal and immoral and contrary to the natural order, that finally broke the uneasy truce. The anger that had been accumulating since 1349 was looking for an outlet. In France, it had already found one, and in England, it was about to. The first explosion came in France, and it came with a savagery that shocked even the brutalized standards of medieval warfare. It was May 1358, just 10 years after the plague's first wave, and the countryside north of Paris had already been devastated twice over, first by the Black Death, then by the roaming English armies of the 100 Years' War, who burned villages and seized crops with systematic efficiency. The peasants of the Beauvais region had endured the plague, watched their neighbors die in the fields, negotiated carefully for their new post-plague wages, and then watched the nobility demand that they repair the war-damaged castles of their lords at their own expense and labor with no compensation, as if the previous decade had not happened at all. It was a miscalculation of historic proportions. On the 28th of May, a group of peasants near the village of Saint-Leu-d'Esserand attacked a group of knights without warning, killed them, and burned their bodies. Within days, the violence had spread across an enormous swath of northern France. The Jacquerie, the name derived from the contemptuous aristocratic nickname for a peasant, Jacques Bonhomme, or Good Fellow Jacques, was not an organized rebellion in any modern sense. It had no centralized leadership, no written manifesto, no coordinated military strategy. What it had was rage, accumulated over generations and suddenly given permission to exist. Peasant bands attacked castles across the region, killing noblemen and their families, burning manor houses, destroying the records that documented their feudal obligations. The chronicler Jean Froissart, writing from a firmly aristocratic perspective, described the violence with horror. Peasants killing knights, violating noblewomen, roasting a knight on a spit in front of his wife and children before forcing her to eat the flesh. Froissart's accounts almost certainly exaggerate the atrocities. He was writing propaganda for the class being attacked, but the core of what happened is documented from multiple sources. The peasants were not merely protesting, they were dismantling, physically and violently, the material infrastructure of the system that had oppressed them. The nobility's response was equally savage. Within weeks, a coalition of French and Navarrese knights under Charles the Bad of Navarre had assembled and begun systematically hunting down the rebel bands. Thousands of peasants were killed. The leaders were executed with the particular theatricality that medieval justice reserved for those who had challenged the social order. The self-proclaimed leader of the rebellion, Guillaume Cal, was captured under a flag of truce, had a red-hot crown of iron placed on his head in mockery of his pretensions to leadership, and was beheaded. The Jacquerie was over in roughly 6 weeks. Militarily, it was a total failure, but it had demonstrated something that could not be undemonstrated, that the peasants of France were willing to kill and die to resist the reimposition of the old order. The nobility had won the battle. The question of whether they had won the war was considerably more complicated. In England, the reckoning came 23 years later, and it was considerably more organized, considerably more politically sophisticated, and considerably more dangerous to the established order. The English Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was not, despite its name, primarily a revolt of agricultural serfs in the traditional sense. The decades after the Black Death had transformed the English peasantry in ways that made them, paradoxically, more capable of organized resistance, precisely because their conditions had improved. People who have slightly more resources, slightly more mobility, slightly more awareness of their own economic value. People who have been told repeatedly by both experience and legislation that they are worth more than the old system acknowledges, are more dangerous to that system than people ground down to absolute subsistence. The post-plague peasantry of England was angry not because nothing had changed, but because enough had changed to make them aware of how much more should change, and how deliberately the ruling class was working to prevent it. The immediate trigger was taxation. 3 poll taxes had been levied in quick succession, in 1377, 1379, and 1381, to fund the ongoing and increasingly expensive wars with France. The 1381 tax was particularly egregious. A flat-rate tax of 1 shilling per head, regardless of income, that fell proportionally far more heavily on the poor than on the wealthy. It was the kind of tax that could only be designed by people who had no particular interest in thinking carefully about what the people paying it could actually afford. Tax collectors arrived in villages across Essex and Kent in late May 1381 and found communities that had already paid once were being asked to pay again and had reached the end of their patience. In the village of Fobbing in Essex, the tax collector was physically driven out by the villagers. The local justice sent to restore order was driven out as well. Within days, the villages of Essex were in open revolt. The movement found its voice in a man named John Ball, a wandering priest who had been excommunicated by the Archbishop of Canterbury and repeatedly imprisoned for preaching doctrines that the Church considered dangerously radical. Ball had been traveling the roads of England for decades, delivering sermons to outdoor crowds that framed the question of social hierarchy in explicitly theological terms. His most famous line, preserved in multiple sources from the period, was a rhyming couplet that became the slogan of the revolt. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? The argument was simple and devastating within the theological framework of medieval Christianity. Before the fall, there were no lords and no serfs. Social hierarchy was not divinely ordained. It was a human invention, created by force and sustained by force, and it had no ultimate spiritual legitimacy. For people whose entire acceptance of their condition had been grounded in the belief that God had placed them there, this was not merely a political argument. It was a liberation theology. The military leader of the revolt was Wat Tyler, a man about whom almost nothing is known beyond his role in the uprising itself. His background, his age, his occupation before June 1381 are all lost to history, which is itself a telling comment on how medieval chroniclers valued the biographical details of the lower orders. What is clear from the sources is that Tyler was an effective organizer and a charismatic leader, capable of maintaining discipline over a force of thousands of ordinary farmers, craftsmen, and tradespeople as they marched on London in early June 1381. They were not, despite the aristocratic contempt evident in every contemporary chronicle account, a disorganized mob. They moved with purpose, they had specific targets, and they knew what they wanted. What they wanted, in the immediate term, was remarkably specific and in some ways remarkably moderate. The abolition of serfdom, a fixed rent of 4 pence per acre for land, the freedom to buy and sell in all markets without restriction, and a pardon for all involved in the revolt. These were not the demands of people trying to overthrow the entire social order. They were the demands of people who had been promised the fruits of the post-plague labor market for 30 years and had been systematically blocked from claiming them by legislation, by judicial persecution, and by the naked self-interest of the ruling class. They wanted the world that the Black Death had accidentally created, the world in which their labor had value, and they had the freedom to negotiate for it, to be officially recognized and protected rather than criminalized. The rebels marched on London, and, in one of the most extraordinary moments in medieval English history, got in. The city's gates were opened for them, probably by sympathizers within London itself, and on the 13th of June, 1381, tens of thousands of peasants and craftsmen poured into the capital of England. They burned the Savoy Palace, the magnificent London residence of John of Gaunt, the king's uncle and the most powerful nobleman in England, who was widely blamed for the poll tax. They stormed the Tower of London and dragged out the Archbishop of Canterbury, Simon Sudbury, and the royal treasurer, Robert Hales, both of whom they beheaded on Tower Hill, and whose heads they mounted on spikes on London Bridge. They burned legal records. They targeted, with striking precision, the documents and the people most directly associated with the mechanisms of feudal control and the hated taxation. The young king, Richard II, was 14 years old. He rode out to meet the rebels at Mile End on the 14th of June, accompanied by a small group of nobles, with the main body of the royal army nowhere near London. What happened next was one of those moments that medieval chroniclers describe in ways that seem almost impossibly dramatic, but which the basic historical record confirms. Richard agreed, in person, to the rebels' demands. He promised the abolition of serfdom. He promised pardons. He issued charters on the spot. The rebels, many of them, took him at his word and began dispersing, returning to their villages with what they believed were royal guarantees of their freedom. The following day, Tyler met Richard again at Smithfield for a second negotiation, at which Tyler apparently made additional demands: the disendowment of the church, the redistribution of church property to the commons, the reduction of the clergy to a single bishop. The exact sequence of what happened next is disputed in the sources, but the outcome is not. Tyler was attacked and fatally stabbed by the Lord Mayor of London, William Walworth, in the presence of the king. The rebel force, which vastly outnumbered the royal party, hesitated, and Richard II, 14 years old, rode forward alone toward the hostile crowd and reportedly called out that he himself would be their leader and that they should follow him to the fields north of the city. They followed him, and then the royal army arrived. The revolt collapsed with the same speed it had assembled. The promised charters were revoked. Richard II issued a statement that has a particular clarity about what the crown actually thought of the rebels' demands. "Villains ye are, and villains ye shall remain." John Ball was captured and executed, hanged, drawn, and quartered in the presence of the king himself. Wat Tyler was already dead. Hundreds of rebels were killed in the reprisals that followed across Essex, Kent, and other affected counties. The legal status of serfdom in England was not formally abolished. The Statute of Labourers remained on the books. On paper, the revolt had achieved nothing. And yet something fundamental had changed, in ways that the royal proclamation could not reverse. The historian R.H. Hilton, who devoted much of his career to studying the English peasantry in this period, argued that the revolt's failure at the level of immediate political demands obscured its deeper significance. What the peasants' revolt demonstrated, to the peasants themselves as much as to the ruling class, was that the old system could not be restored by force alone. The demographic reality that the Black Death had created was not going away. The peasants who had participated in the revolt returned to their villages with the knowledge that they had marched on London, occupied it, killed an archbishop, extracted promises from a king, and made the most powerful ruling class in England genuinely afraid. That knowledge was not something that could be legislated out of existence. The decades that followed the revolt saw the gradual, uneven, but ultimately irreversible erosion of serfdom across Western Europe. Not through dramatic political revolution, but through the accumulated pressure of individual negotiations, legal challenges, flight, and the basic arithmetic of a labor market that continued to favor workers over lords. By the middle of the 15th century, serfdom had effectively disappeared from most of England and much of Western Europe. Land was plentiful. Wages were high by historical standards. The standard of living for surviving peasants was, by several measurable indicators, significantly better than it had been before the plague. The historian's assessment of the 15th century as a golden age for the Western European peasantry, grotesque as that phrase sounds given that it was purchased with the deaths of half the continent, is supported by the data. More meat in the diet, more varied food overall, better clothing, more physical mobility, more legal autonomy. The Eastern European story was the inverse, and that is important to understand why. In Poland, Russia, Prussia, and Hungary, where the plague's demographic impact had been somewhat less severe and where the political structures were different, the nobility responded to the post-plague labor shortage not by gradually conceding to peasant demands, but by dramatically tightening legal controls on the peasantry. The same labor scarcity that gave Western European peasants leverage was used in Eastern Europe as a justification for binding remaining peasants more tightly to the land than ever before, precisely because every lord knew that if his serfs could leave freely, they would. The result was that serfdom in Eastern Europe, rather than gradually dying out in the 15th and 16th centuries as it did in the West, actually intensified, becoming more comprehensive, more legally codified, and more brutal. Russian serfdom would not be formally abolished until 1861. The divergence between Western and Eastern Europe that began in the aftermath of the Black Death had consequences that stretched across 5 centuries. The plague also accelerated changes in the Church that would eventually produce consequences the medieval papacy could not have imagined in 1350. The institutional failure of the Church during the Black Death, the priests who fled, the last rites that were not given, the theological explanations that convinced no one, the Pope sitting between his fires in Avignon while his flock died without spiritual comfort, had permanently damaged the Church's claim to be the infallible intermediary between God and humanity. The humanist intellectual movement that would eventually crystallize into the Renaissance drew much of its energy from the post-plague conviction that received authority, whether medical, theological, or philosophical, needed to be questioned, tested, and, if necessary, discarded. Boccaccio's Decameron, written in the immediate aftermath of the plague years, is saturated with this sensibility. An irreverent, skeptical, deeply human examination of people under extreme pressure, stripped of the comforting certainties of the medieval worldview. It is not a coincidence that the Reformation, which directly challenged the authority of the Roman Church, came roughly 150 years after the Black Death. The seeds had been planted in the plague pits. What the Black Death ultimately demonstrated, across the full arc of its consequences, was something that every era tends to relearn from scratch. That social hierarchies, which depend on keeping the majority of people economically desperate and psychologically subordinate, are structurally fragile in ways that only become visible when the conditions maintaining them are disrupted. The feudal system had endured for 5 centuries not primarily because of its moral legitimacy or its efficiency, but because the demographic conditions of medieval Europe made it impossible for the people at the bottom to credibly threaten to leave. Remove that condition, make labor scarce instead of abundant, and the entire edifice trembled. The Black Death removed that condition with catastrophic violence, in the space of 5 years, across an entire continent. The peasants who survived the plague and found themselves suddenly worth bargaining for did not think of themselves as participants in a labor rights movement. They thought of themselves as Christians trying to survive in a world that God seemed to have abandoned. They did not have the conceptual vocabulary of rights or labor markets or class struggle. What they had was the immediate, practical experience of being needed, perhaps for the first time in their family's memory, and the accumulated anger of people who had been told for their entire lives that their suffering was divinely ordained and deserved. The Statute of Laborers called their new demands arrogance. John Ball called it justice. The history of the 5 centuries that followed, the gradual, contested, frequently violent expansion of the concept of human dignity to include people who had previously been excluded from it, suggests that Ball was closer to the truth. 25 million people died to create the conditions that made it possible. That is the number that sits behind every wage increase, every legal challenge, every burned manor house, every revolutionary sermon preached on a village green. The Black Death did not give medieval peasants their freedom out of any benevolent intention. It gave them leverage by killing their neighbors, their children, their priests, and their lords in roughly equal measure. What they did with that leverage, imperfectly, violently, and at enormous cost, was the first chapter of a story that the modern world is still writing.